She didn't cry when her husband died. She didn't cry when the bank called. She didn't cry when the neighbors stopped coming by. But the night she knelt in the mud next to that horse, her last horse, the one thing she had left that was still breathing, still warm, still hers, that was the night something in her finally cracked open, and what came out wasn't grief. It was something much older, much fiercer. Stay with me. Before we begin, I want to ask you something, and I mean this genuinely. Have you ever watched someone lose everything, and instead of breaking, they somehow become more themselves? More real, like the weight of losing it all burned away everything that wasn't essential? Because that's what this story is about. A woman who was counted out by everyone who knew her name, and a dying horse who, against all odds, became the reason she didn't count herself out too. If that moves something in you, and I think it will, drop a like on this video before we're done. Subscribe if you haven't yet, and tell me in the comments, what city or town are you watching from right now? I read every single one. All right, let's go back to the beginning. The Callaway Ranch sat on 43 acres of high plains in the eastern part of the state, the kind of land that looked beautiful in photographs and punished you every other day of the year. The wind came from the north in January like it had a grudge. The summer dried the creek beds to cracked white lips. And the soil, pale, stubborn, dense, gave back only as much as you put in, usually less. Neva Callaway had lived there for 26 years. She came to the ranch as a young bride, 22 years old, with her hair still dark and her laugh still easy. Her husband, a broad-shouldered, quietly determined man named Wick Callaway, had inherited the land from his father. He wasn't rich, he wasn't charming, but he showed up every single day, and Neva had learned early on that showing up was worth more than almost anything else. They built their life carefully, the way you'd build a fence post by post, slow, deliberate, grounded. They raised cattle for a while. Then they shifted to horses. Not race horses, not anything glamorous. Working horses. Quarter horses bred for endurance and temperament, the kind ranchers trusted and cowboys loved. At their peak, they had 11 animals on the property, and Wick knew every one of them by name, by personality, by the particular way each one moved when something was bothering them. Neva learned to love the horses not the way she'd expected, not through some cinematic moment of galloping across golden fields, but slowly, the way you come to love anything that requires your patience. She learned their moods. She learned that a horse's trust is not given. It is earned incrementally over time through the consistency of your hands and your voice and your presence. They had no children. This was a wound they never talked about out loud, though it shaped everything, the way a stone shapes water that flows around it for years. Then Wick got sick. It was his heart, a slow, stubborn deterioration that the doctors had been watching for 3 years before it finally caught up with him. He died on a Tuesday morning in late October, just as the light was turning that particular amber that makes the plains look like they're holding their breath. He was 61 years old. Neva was 58. She buried him next to the oak tree at the back of the property, the one they'd picnicked under, the summer of their 3rd year together, the one that had grown so wide its shade covered nearly the whole back fence by the time he died. What she didn't fully understand, what Wick had kept from her with the best of intentions, and what she would come to resent and then forgive, was just how deep in debt they were. The horses were expensive. Feed, farrier, veterinary bills, the slow rot of equipment that needed replacing. The herd had shrunk over the years, not dramatically but steadily. By the time Wick passed, they were down to 3 animals. A mare named Duchess, a young gelding with a nervous temperament, and an old bay named Colonel, who had been on the ranch for 14 years, and who Wick had loved with an openness he rarely showed anything else. Within 6 months of Wick's death, the bank was involved. Within 9 months, the gelding had been sold to cover a note. Within a year, Duchess had gone to a family 2 counties over, a sale that Neva had arranged herself, quietly, without telling anyone, because she didn't want to hear the condolences or the advice or the careful voices of people who didn't understand what she was losing. That left Colonel. The neighbors, there were a few spread out across the surrounding properties, had opinions about Neva's situation, as neighbors do. Some were kind in a distant way. Some offered help that felt more like surveillance than generosity. A man named Pruitt, who ran a feed operation nearby, had approached her twice about the land. He was polite. He was persistent. He used words like realistic and practical, in the soft, careful tone of someone who has already decided what you should do and is simply waiting for you to catch up. Neva didn't catch up. She told Pruitt, the second time he came by, that she appreciated his concern. She told him the ranch was not for sale. She told him this with a steadiness in her voice that surprised even herself, because inside she was terrified, bone-deep, sleepless, barely eating terrified. But she didn't show it. Not to him, not to anyone. That was the autumn Colonel got sick and everything changed. It started as a cough, not a violent thing, just a low, persistent rasp that Colonel made in the mornings when Neva came into the barn. She noticed it on a Wednesday and told herself it was dust. The hay had been stored a little damp that year. Things like this happened, but by Friday the cough hadn't cleared. By the following Monday, Colonel's eyes had that dull, sunken quality that anyone who spent time around horses learns to fear. He was eating less. He stood near the far wall of his stall in a way that was slightly wrong, not dramatic, not doubled over, just subtly wrong. The way a person looks when they're running a fever and trying not to let on. Neva called the vet. His name was Amos Birch, and he had been the Calloway family vet for nearly 20 years. He was 65, semi-retired, drove a truck that was older than some of his patients, and had a manner that was so unhurried, so methodically calm, that it either comforted you enormously or drove you to the edge of frustration depending on the day. That particular morning, it comforted Neva. She needed someone to move slowly. She needed someone who wasn't alarmed. Amos listened to Colonel's lungs. He checked his temperature, his gum color, his lymph nodes. He took his time. He didn't say much while he was working, just murmured quiet things to the horse, the way you'd talk to someone while changing a dressing, keeping them focused on something other than the discomfort. When he straightened up, he looked at Neva with an expression she had learned over the years to read carefully. "It's a respiratory infection," he said. "Could be bacterial, could be something more. His lungs are compromised. You can hear it if you know what to listen for." "Can you treat it?" Neva asked. Amos was quiet for a moment. "I can try," he said. "He's old, Neva, 14 years, and the last 2 haven't been easy on him. His immune system isn't what it was." She understood what he was not saying. She had understood it before he arrived, if she was honest with herself. But there is a difference between the understanding you carry alone in the dark before dawn and the understanding that gets spoken aloud by someone else. The second kind is heavier. "Try," she said. Amos prescribed a course of antibiotics and a bronchodilator. He showed Neva how to administer the medications, the injections, the inhaler mask that had to be fitted carefully over Colonel's nose. He told her to keep the stall dry, to monitor his temperature twice a day, to call him immediately if his breathing became labored. He also told her quietly, as he was loading his bag back into his truck, to think about what she wanted. "What I want," Neva repeated, not quite a question. "If things go the direction they sometimes go," Amos said. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Neva stood in the driveway long after his truck disappeared around the bend in the road. The sky was the kind of white-gray that passes for winter on the plains. Not dramatic, not stormy, just endlessly pale and heavy. The wind moved the dead grass along the fence line. Somewhere in the barn, Colonel coughed once, softly. She went back inside. That night, and the 3 nights after it, Neva slept in the barn. Not on a cot, not in a sleeping bag. She dragged out a camp chair and an old wool blanket she'd found in the cedar chest at the foot of her and Wick's bed, a blanket she hadn't touched since the funeral. She sat with Colonel in the way that people sometimes sit with the dying, not trying to fix anything, not saying much, just being present, just letting him know there was still a body in the room that cared whether he made it through to morning. She talked to him sometimes, quietly, the way Amos talked to him, words without urgency, words just for the sake of sound. She told him about the summer she and Wick had bought him, how young he'd seemed, how strong, how Wick had laughed the first time Colonel spooked at a plastic bag in the pasture, and then stood very still afterward, as if embarrassed by his own reaction. She told him about the years, the slow accumulation of ordinary days that made up a life on this land. She told him she was sorry the herd was gone. She told him she was sorry it was just the two of them now. She didn't tell him she was scared, but she thought he knew. On the fourth night, something shifted. Colonel moved to the center of his stall, closer to where Neva sat. He lowered his head in her direction. Not all the way, not dramatically, just a degree or two. It was such a small movement, and Neva felt it move through her like a current. She reached out and rested her hand along the side of his nose. He let her. They stayed like that for a long time. The next morning, he ate. Not much, a small portion of hay, tentative, careful. But he ate. And when Amos came back 4 days later to check on him, the vet listened to his lungs for a long moment, then looked up with an expression that was still measured, still cautious, but different. "He's fighting," Amos said. "I know," said Neva. "So are you," he said, and he said it in a way that wasn't about the horse. She didn't answer, but she stood a little straighter. She hadn't noticed until just then that she'd been hunching her shoulders for months, carrying something heavy in the set of her body that she hadn't consciously chosen to carry. She straightened up, and it felt like the first deliberate thing she'd done since Wick died. That week, a woman came to the ranch for the first time. Her name was Lavinia Holt. She drove a dusty blue pickup truck and wore her hair in a single long braid down her back. She was somewhere in her early 40s, though she had the kind of face that made guessing feel imprecise, weathered in a way that wasn't aging but presence, like she'd been out in the world a long time and hadn't minded. She knocked on Neva's door on a cold Thursday afternoon and explained, without much preamble, that she ran a small equine rescue operation about 40 miles east. She'd heard through Amos, they'd worked together before, that there was a woman on a struggling ranch with a sick horse and no support. She'd come to see if there was anything she could do. Neva's first instinct was to say no. She had spent the last year saying no to Pruitt's land offers, to her sister-in-law's suggestions that she move closer to town, to the quiet collective pressure of a community that had decided, without asking her, what the sensible thing for her to do was. But there was something about Lavinia that disarmed her. Not warmth, exactly. She wasn't a soft person in that way. It was more like directness. Lavinia looked at Neva with a kind of frank, unpitying interest that Neva hadn't experienced in so long she'd almost forgotten what it felt like. "I'm not here to talk you out of anything," Lavinia said, standing on the porch in the cold. "I'm just here to look if you'll let me, and maybe have a cup of coffee." Neva let her in. They drank their coffee at the kitchen table. Lavinia looked around the house with an unhurried attention, not nosy, not evaluating, just observant. She noticed the photographs on the wall, the horse ribbons hung near the mudroom door, the particular neatness of a space that had been maintained with care over a long time. "Wick's ribbons?" she asked, nodding toward them. "Colonel's," Neva said. "From years back, when we used to show a little. Not seriously, just local things." "He was a good horse." "He is a good horse," Neva said. The correction was small but deliberate. Lavinia nodded. She understood the grammar of that. After coffee, Neva brought her to the barn. Lavinia approached Colonel the way Amos did, unhurried, no sudden movements, letting the animal register her presence before she reached for him. Colonel watched her with those dark, old eyes. He didn't flinch. Lavinia ran her hand along his neck, checked his eyes, listened to his breathing without a stethoscope, just by leaning close, the way someone does who has spent years learning to read animals without instruments. "He's not done," she said almost to herself. "No," Neva agreed. "He's not." Lavinia straightened and looked at Neva directly. "Here's what I can offer," she said. "I have access to a vet tech named Cassidy who specializes in respiratory cases in older horses. She's better than most vets I know, honestly. I can bring her out here, no charge to you. She does pro bono work for cases she cares about, and she'll care about this one. And I can get you hay, good dry hay, enough to last through the winter, donated from a farm I work with." Neva was quiet. "Why?" she asked after a moment. It wasn't hostile. It was genuine. Lavinia looked at her with that same steady directness. "Because Amos told me about you. And because this kind of situation," she paused, searching for the right word, "this kind of isolation, it's not just hard on the horse. And someone should say that out loud." The silence that followed was not awkward. It was the particular quiet of two women who had both, in different ways, learned to carry things alone, recognizing each other. Neva looked down at her hands on the stall gate. Rough hands, capable hands. Hands that had done an enormous amount of work over the years, mostly without acknowledgement. "All right," she said. "All right." Cassidy arrived 3 days later. She was younger than either of them. Mid-30s, compact and precise, with the particular focus of someone who had learned their craft by paying very close attention for a very long time. She spent nearly 2 hours with Colonel. She adjusted his medication protocol, added a nebulizer treatment that she showed Neva how to administer, and recommended specific changes to the barn's ventilation. She was also to Neva's quiet relief, not precious about hope. She didn't promise things. She didn't use soft language designed to cushion bad news in advance. She simply said, "His lungs have been stressed, but they're responding. The next 3 weeks will tell us a lot. Keep doing what you're doing. The nighttime presence especially. Animals heal better when they're not alone. That's not sentiment. That's actually how it works." Never thought about that for a long time after Cassidy left. The next 3 weeks were a kind of vigil. Neva woke at 5 every morning to do the first temperature check. She administered the medications with the careful precision of someone who has decided that precision matters, that the small things done right add up to something real. She sat with Colonel in the evenings, not always talking, sometimes just reading. An old ranch almanac she'd found on Wick's bookshelf, a battered mystery novel from the pile by the couch, just the sound of her voice, just presence. The hay Lavinia had arranged arrived on a flatbed truck one Saturday, stacked and dry and smelling like summer. 2 young men helped unload it without being asked, without making a production of it. They stacked it in the dry part of the barn and left without waiting to be thanked. Neva stood and looked at it for a while afterward. She hadn't cried when Wick died, but she cried then, alone in her barn, with the good hay stacked around her and her old horse breathing steadily 20 feet away. Not from sadness, from something else. Something she didn't have a precise word for, but that felt like a door opening after a very long time of being closed. Word travels in small communities the way water moves through soil, slowly, invisibly, and then all at once. By December, people knew about Neva Calloway and the sick horse. They knew because Lavinia had let it slip at the feed co-op. They knew because Cassidy had mentioned it to a client who mentioned it to someone else. They knew because the truck delivering hay had been seen, because someone driving past had noticed the lights in the barn at strange hours, because in flat, open country, it is very difficult to have a private struggle. Some people responded the way Neva had expected, with the polite, measured concern of people who have already decided the situation is hopeless and don't want to be inconvenienced by optimism. Pruitt came by a 3rd time in late November. He was unfailingly courteous. He brought a pie his wife had made, and he sat across Neva's kitchen table with that same patient expression, the one that said, "I am a reasonable man waiting for a reasonable woman to come to her senses." Neva thanked him for the pie. She told him the ranch was still not for sale. She told him she'd made peace with the difficulty of her situation, and that peace wasn't the same as surrender. He left without pressing further, but something in his manner suggested he'd be back. What Neva hadn't expected, what no one had predicted, including Lavinia, was what happened in the 2nd week of December. A man appeared at the edge of the property on a Tuesday morning. He was walking the perimeter of the fence line as if examining it. Not trespassing, just walking the edge, looking over. He was tall and angular, in his mid-60s, with a weathered face under a canvas hat. Neva watched him from the kitchen window for a few minutes before going out. His name was Theron Mace. He introduced himself without awkwardness, with the directness of someone accustomed to outdoor spaces where excessive ceremony doesn't make much sense. He said he'd bought the old Delaney property about 8 miles north the previous spring. He was a retired farrier, had spent 40 years working horses across the region before retiring, and had moved back to the area to be near his daughter's family. He'd heard about Colonel. He'd driven over because he wanted to see if the fence line on the east side was as bad as it looked from the road. "It's bad," Neva confirmed. "I can fix it," he said. "If you'll let me." She looked at him. "What do you want for it?" He considered the question without offense. "Nothing. I've got time, and I don't do well with too much sitting." It took Neva a long moment. She was not comfortable with charity, had never been. There was a pride in her that was not arrogance, but something more functional, the pride of someone who had always managed their own affairs and felt the dignity of that management as something real, something worth protecting. But she thought about what Cassidy had said, about healing being harder alone, and she thought about the hay and the way those two young men had stacked it without making her feel small, and the way Lavinia had drunk coffee at her table without pity. "All right," she said for the second time in a month to a near stranger. "Thank you." Theron started on the fence that same afternoon. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that. He worked without needing direction, which was the thing Neva appreciated most. He could see what needed doing, and he did it, without requiring her to manage the process of his help. They fell into a quiet routine. He would arrive around 8. She would have coffee ready. They'd exchange a few words about the weather, about Colonel's progress, about the condition of some specific stretch of fence. Then he'd go work, and she'd go about her own tasks, and sometimes they'd cross paths during the day, and sometimes they wouldn't. It was not dramatic, but it was, Neva realized, a kind of companionship. Not Wick, nothing like Wick, but something warm and low-key and genuinely helpful, the way good tools are helpful, the way good weather is helpful. Without fanfare, just present. Meanwhile, Colonel was getting better. Slowly, in the stubborn, incremental way that old creatures heal. Not a sudden turn, not a dramatic recovery, but a steady accumulation of better mornings. His appetite improved. His cough diminished to something occasional, rather than chronic. He started moving toward the barn door when Neva approached, the way he used to, nose out, ears forward. That specific expression horses make when they expect something good from you. On the morning of December 18th, Cassidy came for what she said would be her final check. She listened to Colonel's lungs for a long time. She checked every measurement twice. Then she straightened and looked at Neva with an expression that was still precise, still unembellished, but unmistakably changed. "He made it," she said. Neva put her hand on Colonel's neck. He was warm. He was breathing evenly. He turned his head slightly and pushed his nose against her arm in the minimal, deliberate way horses do when they're acknowledging you. "I know," Neva said. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. What she felt in that moment was not simply relief. It was something more structural, like a shift in the architecture of what she believed was possible. For over a year, she had been in a long, slow freefall. Not dramatic, not with screaming or collapse. Just that quiet, relentless loss of footing that comes when everything you've built your life around starts to disappear, one thing at a time. But Colonel was standing in front of her, eating hay from her hand, and the fence on the east side was fixed, and there was enough feed in the barn to last through spring, and somehow, in the middle of all the difficulty, she had not lost the ranch. She had not left. She had not surrendered to what everyone else had decided was the only sensible thing. She had stayed, and something had stayed with her. January came in hard and bright, the way it sometimes does on the plains, cold that cracked the silence. Sky so blue it looked painted, the kind of beauty that punishes you if you linger in it too long without preparation. Never was more prepared than she'd been in years. She didn't think of it in those terms right away, but she noticed it in small ways, the way she planned ahead, laid in supplies before the storms, moved through her mornings with a purposefulness that had been missing. The freefall had stopped. Something solid had come up to meet her feet. Lavinia had stayed in contact. They talked on the phone every week or so, not long calls, not effusive ones, just the practical, sustaining kind. Lavinia was expanding her rescue operation and had started asking Neva, tentatively, whether she'd ever considered taking on a rescue animal. Just one, she said, just to see how it felt. Neva thought about it, said she wasn't sure the ranch was in the right condition. Lavinia said she'd seen the photos Theron had sent her. Apparently the two of them had spoken, which Neva filed away with mild amusement, and the place looked more than capable. One afternoon in mid-January, Lavinia called with a specific case. There was a mare, 7 years old, recovered from neglect, healthy now but shy, still learning that humans weren't going to hurt her. Her name, given by the rescue, was Fern. She'd been at Lavinia's facility for 6 months. She needed a quiet place. She needed space. She needed someone patient. That's not a rescue situation, Neva said slowly. That's a rehabilitation situation. Yes, Lavinia said. Do you see a difference? Neva sat with that for a moment. Did she? When she'd married Wick, she'd come to this land raw and uncertain, more capable than she knew, but unproven. When Colonel had gotten sick, she'd sat in that barn night after night, learning something she hadn't known she could do, learning how to hold vigil without losing herself. When Theron had arrived and started fixing her fences, she'd learned how to receive help without shame. She was, in some ways, in rehabilitation herself. When can you bring her? Neva asked. Fern arrived on a Saturday, transported in Lavinia's trailer, and she came down the ramp with the particular caution of an animal that has learned to move through the world carefully. She was a bay, similar coloring to Colonel, though slighter, more refined in build. She had a small star-shaped marking between her eyes and a way of holding her ears that was always slightly tilted, listening. She went into the stall next to Colonel's. For the first 24 hours, she stood near the back wall, still and watchful. Neva didn't crowd her. She moved through the barn with the quiet, steady rhythm that Colonel had first taught her years ago. The kind of presence that says, I'm here, I'm not a threat, I have no demands of you right now. On the second day, Fern moved to the front of her stall when Neva came in. On the fourth day, she allowed her nose to be touched. On the sixth day, Neva stood in the barn aisle between the two horses, Colonel on one side, Fern on the other, and felt something she had no precise language for, except that it had to do with fullness, a sense of the space being right-sized again, of purpose that was present tense. Theron, when he came by that week and saw Fern, said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Good," that was all, and it was exactly enough. The news of Fern's arrival rippled outward the way things do. Lavinia mentioned it at a meeting of a regional horse welfare group. A woman named Odile, who ran a small trail riding operation about 20 miles away, heard and contacted Neva to ask about Colonel. She'd heard he was a steady, experienced horse with good manners, and she was wondering if Neva ever offered any kind of partnership arrangement, perhaps trail guiding, perhaps just occasional use of the property for small groups. Neva didn't say yes immediately. She sat with the idea for 2 weeks, turning it over the way you turn a stone to see what's underneath. It wasn't the money, though the money mattered. It was whether she wanted people on this land, whether she was ready for that. She thought about what the land had been under Wick, productive, purposeful, alive with the particular busyness of a working ranch. She thought about what it had been in the year after his death, quiet, contracting, going still, the way things go still when the life drains out of them. She thought about what it was now, still small, still stripped back, but breathing again, purposeful, in a new way, not Wick's way, her way. She called Odile back and said she was open to a conversation. That conversation led to a trial arrangement in March. 3 small groups, 4 to 5 people each, coming out for guided trail experiences on weekend afternoons. Neva would host. Colonel, if his health continued to hold, would participate in a limited way, not as a riding horse, but as what Odile called an ambassador, a horse that visitors could meet, spend time with, learn from. It was not a business, not yet, but it was a direction. And direction, Neva had learned, is what keeps you going when you can't yet see the destination. The letter arrived on the 2nd Friday of February. It came from the bank, not from the branch officer she'd dealt with locally, but from a legal department 2 states away, with a logo at the top of the letterhead that she recognized immediately as the entity that held the note on the Callaway Ranch. She had known this entity existed in the abstract, in the background of her financial life, the way people know about structural things, the foundation, the load-bearing walls, without thinking about them, until something goes wrong. She read the letter twice at the kitchen table. Then she set it down and looked out the window at the barn. The letter was not a foreclosure notice. It was something more complicated than that, and, in some ways, harder to navigate. It was a restructuring notice, the kind of language that sounds almost generous on the surface, but carries within it a specific deadline, a specific sum, a specific set of conditions that, if unmet, would trigger a process she very much did not want triggered. The number they were asking for, as an initial lump payment to restructure the terms, was not enormous. In a different context, in a different year of her life, she might have managed it without much difficulty. But in the context of her current situation, the depleted savings, the minimal income, the costs of Colonel's illness, it was, as things stood, impossible. She had 60 days. Neva sat at that table for a long time. The winter light moved across the kitchen floor. Colonel coughed once, distantly in the barn, not the sick cough of November, but the ordinary cough of a horse on a cold morning. She picked up the phone and called Lavinia. Lavinia was quiet while Neva read her the key sections. Then she was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "Let me make some calls." "This isn't your problem," Neva said. "No," Lavinia agreed, "but it's something I can help with. Those are different things." Neva didn't argue. She was learning, slowly and with some difficulty, the difference between pride that protected her and pride that imprisoned her. What happened over the next 3 weeks was not magic. It was not a single benefactor or a dramatic solution. It was something more textured than that, and Neva would later think more true. Lavinia reached out to the equine rescue network she'd been part of for years. She framed Neva's situation not as charity, but as an investment in a recovery program that was already beginning. The rescue of Fern, the potential trail partnership with Odile, the rehabilitation work that the Callaway Ranch was quietly beginning to do. She was specific. She was factual. She did not oversell. Theron, independently, had a conversation with his son-in-law, a man named Aldworth, who ran a small agricultural investment fund focused on preserving working ranch operations. Aldworth drove out on a Saturday and walked the property with the quiet attention of someone who knew what he was looking at. He spent time in the barn. He asked Neva questions, direct, practical questions, the kind that required real answers. He looked at the fence Theron had fixed. He looked at Fern, and then at Colonel. At the end of the walk, he said he wanted to be involved, not as a creditor, not as a partner with authority, as what he called a quiet supporter, a fund contribution, no repayment required, toward the specific cost of the bank restructuring. His fund existed precisely for situations like this, ranch operations with genuine viability that had been temporarily disrupted by circumstance. The Callaway Ranch, he said, met that definition. Neva stood in the cold winter yard and looked at him. "Why does your fund exist?" she asked. Not suspiciously, she genuinely wanted to understand. Aldworth considered the question. "Because family agricultural land disappears," he said, "and once it's gone, it doesn't come back. And a lot of the time, it disappears not because the operation failed, but because the people running it ran out of support at the wrong moment. We try to be that support. She thought about Wick, about the slow erosion of the herd, the debt accumulating in the background while he kept his chin up and his worries mostly to himself. She thought about how different things might have been if someone had offered this kind of support 5 years earlier. Before everything got so precarious, she couldn't change that. But she was here now. "All right," she said. It was the third time she'd said it to a stranger in 3 months. It kept getting easier. Not because she had become less herself, but because she had become more certain that asking for help, when it was offered in good faith, was its own kind of strength. The check came through in early March. Neva drove to the bank, sat across from the loan officer, a woman named Gareth who had been patient and professional throughout, and submitted the restructured payment. The new terms were not comfortable, but they were manageable. They were the kind of thing you could work toward day by day if you had income coming in and kept your costs tight and didn't lose your nerve. She drove home through flat, open country. The sky was enormous. The road was straight and long. She drove with the window cracked, the cold air coming in, and she felt, this is the closest word she ever found for it, released. Not from responsibility, not from difficulty, but from the particular paralysis of a situation that had seemed to have no direction. That evening, Tyrone came by with a thermos of coffee and leaned on the fence with her. While the last light drained out of the western sky, Colonel was visible from where they stood, moving in the near pasture for the first time, walking under his own power in the open air, unhurried. Fern was out there too, keeping a careful distance, but not fleeing. They watched the two horses move in the fading light without saying anything for a long time. Then Theron said, "Your east fence will need touching up in spring." "I know," Neva said. "I'll be around." She looked at him. "I appreciate that." He nodded and poured more coffee. That was all. That was everything. Inside the house, on the kitchen table, was a pad of paper where Neva had been working. Numbers, projections, a rough outline of what the next year could look like. Not optimistic projections, honest ones. The kind that assume some things go wrong, but leave room for things going right. The kind that require you to show up every day without certainty of the outcome, which is, she had come to understand, just the definition of living. She went inside. She looked at the numbers. She picked up her pen. She started writing. Spring came to the Callaway Ranch in the way it always had, grudgingly, incrementally, then all at once. First, the mud. Then the first pale green along the creek bed. Then the particular smell of warming soil that cannot be described to someone who hasn't spent time in open country, but that everyone who has spent time there knows like a mother tongue. Odile brought the first trail group out on a Saturday in late March. 5 people, 3 women and 2 men, all of them somewhere between 40 and 65, all of them looking for something that wasn't quite exercise and wasn't quite therapy, but lived somewhere in the territory between. They came from a town about 30 miles west. They wore good boots and bad hats and asked questions that showed they'd never spent much time around horses. Neva walked them through the basics. She moved through the barn with them, showing them how to approach a horse, where to stand, how to read an ear position or a tail flick. She was not performing. She was simply teaching what she knew, which was considerable, and she had not realized until she started speaking how much she knew. Colonel stood in his stall and accepted the attention of 5 strangers with the quiet dignity of an animal that has been around long enough to understand that humans mean well most of the time, even when they're awkward about it. He let himself be touched on the nose, on the neck, along his jaw. He blinked his old, dark, steady eyes. One of the women, her name was Bet Rose, and she had recently lost her husband, stood with her hand on Colonel's neck for a long time and didn't say anything. Neva stood nearby but gave her space. After a while, Betta Rose said, without turning, "Does he know?" "Know what?" Neva asked. "That he's helping." Neva thought about those nights in the barn, the wool blanket, the almanac, The long, dark, quiet hours when she and Colonel had kept each other company through something neither of them could fully articulate. "I think he does," she said. Odile called her the following Monday. All 5 had asked to come back. Could they schedule a regular date? By May, there were 2 regular groups and a waiting list for a third. Lavinia came out for a visit in April, bringing with her a young woman named Sparrow, who was interested in learning more about equine rehabilitation, specifically the kind of hands-on relationship-based work that Neva had stumbled into through necessity, and which was apparently valuable and difficult to find. Sparrow was 26, earnest, and asked very good questions. Neva found herself, to her own surprise, enjoying the teaching, enjoying the transmission of knowledge, enjoying being, for someone else, what she herself had needed and not had. She wasn't sure yet what to call what was happening on the ranch. It was still small, it was still modest, there was still a lot that could go wrong, and she hadn't forgotten that. She was not a woman who forgot what could go wrong. But there was also this. The barn had horses in it. The fence was straight. The pasture was green. The numbers, carefully tended, were moving in the right direction. And most mornings there was coffee on and work to do, and someone who would stop by sometime in the day, and that someone would know her by name, and she would know theirs. She had not saved the ranch by finding a buried treasure or winning a lawsuit or stumbling into a convenient inheritance. She had saved it, if saved is even the right word, and she thought it probably was, by staying, by doing the next thing, and then the next, by learning again and again that the right response to a situation that seemed impossible was not to decide it was impossible, but to take one more step and see what was still standing on the other side. Colonel was turning 15 in June. Amos, when he came for his spring visit, listened to his lungs and said they were about as good as could be expected for a horse of his age and history. Better, maybe. Hard to say exactly. "He seems happy," Amos said. He said it scientifically, the way he said everything, but there was something underneath it that was less clinical. "He does," Neva said. "So do you," he said. She didn't argue. There is a photograph hanging in the mudroom of the Callaway Ranch now, next to the old horse ribbons. It was taken on a Sunday afternoon in late May by Sparrow, who had started coming out weekly and had a quiet eye for moments worth keeping. In the photograph, Neva is standing at Colonel's head in the south pasture. The light is the long, warm, late afternoon kind that makes everything look the way we wish it always looked. Colonel's head is turned slightly toward her. She is not looking at the camera. She is looking at him. The expression on her face is not happiness exactly. It is something more complicated than happiness. It is the expression of someone who has been through a great deal and has come out the other side not unscathed, but intact. Someone who knows what things cost and has decided they are worth it anyway. She didn't ask Sparrow to print it. Sparrow brought it over one morning, already framed, and handed it over without ceremony, never looked at it for a moment, and then hung it in the mudroom where she would see it every morning going out and every evening coming in. That was important to her, not the ceremony of it. She was not a ceremonial person, but the placement, the decision to put it somewhere practical rather than decorative, to make it a thing she lived with, not a thing she displayed. By the end of that summer, there were 3 horses on the property, Colonel, Fern, and a young rescue gelding named Pa, who had arrived in June with trust issues and a tendency to bite if you reached for him too fast. Neva had spent 6 weeks establishing the particular kind of baseline trust that has to precede everything else. By August, Pa was eating from her hand. Lavinia called this the real work. She meant it in the way people mean things when they're trying to say something is both difficult and worthwhile, which is, Neva had come to think, the definition of almost everything that matters. She did not think about Pruitt much. He had not come by since February. Whether he had given up or simply turned his attention elsewhere, she didn't know and didn't particularly care. The land was hers. The mortgage was being paid. The future was not certain, but it was present, which was all she had ever really needed. She thought about Wick, not with grief, exactly. Not the sharp grief of the first year, which had been like walking with a stone in your boot that you couldn't remove. More like the sustained, softer awareness of someone who has been shaped by another person and carries them forward in the way you carry anything that has fundamentally changed you. She thought about what he would have made of all this. The rescue horses, the trail groups, the young woman named Sparrow coming out weekly to learn, the quiet, steady presence of Theron, whose friendship had grown into something she relied on without embarrassment. She thought Wick would have been surprised. He had been, at his core, a private man. He had run the ranch as a private operation, a closed system, and she had followed his lead. But she had discovered, through necessity, that openness had its own kind of strength, that a closed system tends, eventually, to collapse inward, that the fence Theron had fixed was stronger for having been worked on by more than one pair of hands. She thought Wick would have been proud. She was not sure of many things, but she was sure of that. On the last Saturday of August, Never sat on the porch in the evening as the light went out. The horses were visible in the pasture, all three of them, moving with that specific low-headed, unhurried quality that horses take on at the end of a good day, when the heat is fading and the grass is coming up with the evening damp. Colonel walked to the near fence and looked at her. She lifted her hand. He watched for a moment, steady, certain, present, and then went back to grazing. She sat there until it was full dark. Then she went inside, washed her hands, and started on tomorrow's feed order. There was work to do. There was always work to do. That was not a complaint. That had never been a complaint. That was the whole point. She had the ranch. She had the horses. She had, against every reasonable expectation, stayed. And the land, stubborn as it was, patient as it was, punishing and beautiful in equal measure, the land had stayed with her. I think about Neva Calloway sometimes when I'm in a moment that feels like it only has one ending. You know what I mean? Those moments when the situation seems so decided, so sealed up and final, that choosing anything other than surrender feels like stubbornness rather than strength. When everyone around you is using words like realistic and practical, as if those words preclude courage. What Neva did was not extraordinary in the dramatic sense. She didn't discover a cure. She didn't win a fortune. She didn't do anything that would look impressive on a list of accomplishments. She stayed. She got up every morning and she took care of what needed taking care of. She let people help her without letting that diminish her. She learned new things in her late 50s on a broken-down ranch with a sick horse and a bank letter on her kitchen table. And that, quiet as it is, undramatic as it is, I think, one of the braver things a person can do. If you've stayed with me through this story, I want to say thank you. These stories matter to me. I believe that the lives lived quietly, without fanfare, on the margins of the world's attention. Those lives are worth knowing, worth telling, worth your hour. If this one moved you, please leave a like on this video. It takes 2 seconds and it helps this channel reach people who might need exactly this kind of story today. Subscribe if you haven't. We put out new stories every week, and I think you'll find ones that land close to home. And I mean it when I ask. Tell me where you're watching from. Drop your city or town in the comments. I read them. I think about you out there, in your kitchen, on your commute, in your own particular version of difficult. And I'm glad you're here. Until next time, take care of the things that are still standing, and take care of yourself.